Third principle. If you don't do this, you are headed for trouble. Back in 1898, a tragic thing happened in Rockland County, New York. A child had died, and on this particular day, the neighbors were preparing to go to the funeral. Jim went out to the barn to hitch up his horse. The ground was covered with snow. The air was cold and snappy. The horse hadn't been exercised for days, and as he was led out to the watering trough, he wheeled playfully, wicked both his heels high in the air, and killed Jim. So the little village of Stony Point had 2 funerals that week instead of 1. The air was cold and snappy. The horse hadn't been exercised for days, and as he was led out to watching through, he wheeled playfully, kicked both his heels high in the air, and killed Jim Farley. So the little village of Stony Point had 2 funerals that week instead of 1. Jim Farley left behind him a widow and 3 boys, and a few $100s in insurance. His oldest boy, Jim, was 10, and he went to work in brickyard, wheeling sand and pouring it into the molds and turning the brick on edge to be dried by the sun. This boy, Jim, never had a chance to get much education, but with his natural geniality. Genealogy. Get much education, but with his geniality, he had a flair for making people like him. So he went into politics, and as the years went by, he developed an uncanny ability for remembering people's names. He never saw the inside of high school, but before he was 46 years of age, 4 colleges had honored him with degrees, and he had become chairman of the Democratic National Committee and Postmaster General of the United States. I once interviewed Jim Farley and asked him the secret of his success. He said, hard work, and I said, don't be funny. He then asked me why I thought was the reason for his success. I replied, I understand you can call 10,000 people by their first names. No, you're wrong, he said. I can call 50,000 people by their first names. Make no mistake about it. That ability helped Mr. Farley put Franklin D. Roosevelt in the White House when he managed Roosevelt's campaign in 1932. During the years that Jim Farley traveled as the salesman for a gypsum concern, and during the years that he held offices as town clerk in Stony Point, he built up a system for remembering names. In the beginning, it was a very simple one. Whenever he met a new acquaintance, he found out his or her complete name and some facts about his or her family, business, and political opinions. He fixed all these facts well in mind as part of the picture, and the next time he met that person, even if it was a year later, he was able to shake hands, inquire after the family, and ask about the hollyhocks in the backyard. No wonder he developed a following. For months before Roosevelt's campaign for president began, Jim Farley wrote hundreds of letters a day to people all over the western and northwestern states. Then he hopped onto a train and in 19 days covered 20 states and 12,000 miles, traveling by buggy, train, automobile, and boat. He would drop into town, meet his people at lunch or breakfast, tea, or dinner, and give them a heart-to-heart talk. Then he'd dash off again on another leg for his journey. As soon as he arrived back east, he wrote to one person in each town he had visited, asking for a list of all the guests to whom he had talked. The final list contained thousands and thousands of names, yet each person on that list was paid the subtle flattery of getting a personal letter from James Farley. These letters began Dear Bill or Dear Jane, and they were always signed Jim. Jim Farley discovered early in life that the average person is more interested in his or her own name than in all the other names on earth put together. Remember that name and call it easily, and you have paid a subtle and very effective compliment. But forget it or misspell it, and you have placed yourself at a sharp disadvantage. For example, I once organized a public speaking course in Paris and sent from letters to all the American residents in the city. French typists with apparently little knowledge of English filled in the names, and naturally they made blunders. One man, the manager of a large American bank in Paris, wrote me a scathing rebuke because his name had been misspelled. Person is more interested in his or her own name than in all the other names on earth put together. Remembering that name and call it easily. Remember that name and call it easily, and you have paid a subtle and very effective compliment. But forgetting it, misspelling it, you can be placed a sharp disadvantage. Sometimes it is difficult to remember a name, particularly if it is hard to pronounce. Rather than even try to learn it, many people ignore it or call the person by an easy nickname. Sid Levi called a customer for some time whose name is Nicodemus Papadopoulos. Most people just call him Nick. Levi told us, I made a special effort to say his name over several times to myself before I made my call. When I greeted him by his full name, Good morning, Mr. Nicodem, he was shocked. For what seemed like several minutes there was no reply from him at all. Finally he said, with tears rolling down his cheeks, Mr. Levi, in all the 15 years I have been in this country, nobody has ever made that effort to call me by my right name. What was the reason for Andrew's success? He was called the Steel King, yet he himself knew little about the manufacture of steel. He had hundreds of people working for him who knew far more about steel than he did, but he knew how to handle people, and that is what made him rich. He knew how to handle people, and that is what made him rich. Early in life, he showed a flair for organization, a genius for leadership. By the time he was 10, he too had discovered the astounding importance people place on their own name, and he used that discovery to win cooperation. To illustrate, when he was a boy back in Scotland, he got hold of a mother rabbit. Presto! And he soon had a whole nest of little rabbits and nothing to feed them. But he had a brilliant idea. He told the boys and girls in the neighborhood that if they would go out and pull enough clover and dandelions, dandelions to feed the rabbits, he would name the bunnies in their honor. The plan worked like magic. The Carnegie never forget it. Years later, he made millions by using the same psychology in business. For example, he wanted to sell steel rails to the Pennsylvania Railroad, was the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad then, so Andrew built a huge steel mill in Pittsburgh and called it the Thompson Steel Works. Here is the riddle. See if you can guess it. When the Pennsylvania Railroad needed steel rails, where do you suppose Thompson would buy them? No, you're wrong. Guess again. When Carnegie and George were battling each other for supremacy in the railroad sleeping car business, the Steel King again remembered the lesson of the rabbits. The Central Transportation Company, which Andrew Carnegie controlled, was fighting with the company that Pullman owned. Both were struggling to get the sleeping car business of the Union Pacific Railroad, bucking each other, slashing prices, and destroying all chance of profit. Both Carnegie and Pullman had gone to New York to see the board of directors of the Union Pacific. Meeting one evening in the St. Nicholas Hotel, he said, "Good evening, Mr. Pullman. Aren't we making a couple of fools of ourselves?" "What do you mean?" Pullman demanded. Then Carnegie expressed what he had on his mind, a merger of their two interests. He pictured in glowing terms the mutual advance of working with, instead of against, each other. Pullman listened attentively, but he was not wholly convinced. Finally, he asked, "What would you call the new company?" And Carnegie replied promptly, "Why, the Pullman Palace Car Company, of course." Brightened. "Come into my room," he said. "Let's talk it over." That talk made industrial history. This policy of remembering and honoring the names of his friends and business associates was one of the secrets of Andrew's leadership. He was proud of the fact that he could call many of the factory workers by their first names, and he boasted that while he was personally in charge, no strike ever disturbed his flaming steel mills. Benton Love, chairman of Texas Commerce Bankshares, believes that the bigger a corporation gets, the colder it becomes. One way to warm it up, he said, is to remember people's names. The executive who tells me he can't remember names is at the same time telling me he can't remember a significant part of his business and is operating on quicksand. Karen Kirsch of Rancho Palos Verdes, California, a flight attendant for TWA, made it a practice to learn the names of as many passengers in her cabin as possible, and use the name when serving them. This resulted in many compliments on her service, expressed both to her directly and to the airline. One passenger wrote, "I haven't flown TWA for some time, but I'm going to start flying nothing but TWA from now on. You make me feel that your airline has become a very personalized airline, and this is important to me. People are so proud of their names that they strive to perpetuate them at any cost." Even blistering, hard-boiled old P.T. Barnum, the greatest showman of his time, disappointed because he had no sons to carry on his names, offered his grandson, C.H. Silly, $25,000 if he would call himself Barnum Silly. For many centuries, nobles and magnates supported artists, musicians, and authors so that their creative works would be dedicated to them. Libraries and museums owe their richest collections to people who cannot bear to think that their names might perish from memory of the race. The New York Public Library has its Astor and Lennox collections. The Metropolitan Museum perpetuates the names of Benjamin Altman and J.P. Morgan, and nearly every church is beautified by stained glass windows commemorating the names of their donors. Many of the buildings on the campus of most universities bear the names of donors who contributed large sums of money for his honor. Most people don't remember names for the simple reason that they don't take the time and energy necessary to concentrate and repeat and fix names indelibly in their minds. They make excuses for themselves. They are too busy. But they were probably no busier than Franklin D., and he took time to remember and recall even the names of mechanics with whom he came into contact. To illustrate, the Chrysler organization built a special car for Mr. Roosevelt, who could not use a standard car because his legs were paralyzed. W.F. Chamberlain and a mechanic delivered it to the White House. I have in front of me a letter from Mr. Chamberlain relating his experiences. I taught President Roosevelt how to handle a car with a lot of unusual gadgets, but he taught me a lot about the fine art of handling people. When I called at the White House, Mr. Chamberlain writes, the president was extremely pleasant and cheerful. He called me by name, made me feel very comfortable, and particularly impressed me with the fact that he was vitally interested in things I had to show him and tell him. The car was so designed that it could be operated entirely by hand. A crowd gathered around to look at the car, and he remarked, I think it is marvelous. And you have to do is to touch a button and it moves away and you can drive it without effort. I think it is grand. I don't know what makes it go, and I'd love to have the time to tear it down and see how it works. When Roosevelt's friends and associates admired the machine, he said in their presence, Mr. Chamberlain, I certainly appreciate all the time and effort you have spent in developing this car. It is a mighty fine job. He admired the radiator, the special rear vision mirror and clock, the special spotlight, the kind of upholstery, the sitting position of the driver's seat, the special suitcase and the trunk with his monogram on each suitcase. In other words, he took notice of every detail to which he knew I had given considerable thought. He made a point of bringing these various pieces of equipment to the attention of Mrs. and his secretary. He even brought the old White House porter into the picture by saying, George, you want to take particularly good care of the suitcases. When the driving lesson was finished, the president turned to me and said, well, Mr. Chamberlain, I have been keeping the Federal Board waiting 30 minutes. I guess I had better get back to work. I took a mechanic with me to the White House. He was introduced to Roosevelt when he arrived. He didn't talk to the president, and Roosevelt heard his name only once. He was a shy chap, and he kept in the backyard. But before leaving us, the president looked for the mechanic, shook his hand, called him by his name, and thanked him for coming to Washington, and there was nothing perfunctory about his thanks. He meant what he said, and I could feel that. A few days after returning to New York, I got an autographed photograph of President Roosevelt and a little note of thanks, again expressing his appreciation for my assistance. How he found time to do it is a mystery to me. Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that one of the simplest, most obvious, and most important ways of gaining goodwill wars by remembering names and making people feel important, yet how many of us do it? One of the simplest, most obvious, and most important ways of gaining goodwills is by remembering names and making people feel important. Half the time we are introduced to a stranger, we chat a few minutes and can't even remember his or her name by the time we say goodbye. One of the first lessons politicians learn is this: to recall a voter's name is statesmanship, to forget it is oblivion. And the ability to remember names is almost as important in business and social contact as it is in politics. To recall a voter's name is a statesmanship, to forget it is oblivion. And the ability to remember names is almost as important in business and social contact as it is in politics. Napoleon III, Emperor of France and nephew of the greatest Napoleon, boasted that in spite of all his royal duties, he could remember the name of every person he met. His technique? Simple. If he didn't hear the name distinctly, he said, "So sorry, I didn't get the name clearly." Then, if it was the unusual name, he would say, "How is it spelled?" During the conversation, he took the trouble to repeat the names several times and try to associate it in his mind with the person's features, expression, and general appearance. If the person was someone of importance, Napoleon went to even further pains. As soon as His Royal Highness was gone, he wrote the name down on the piece of paper, looked at it, concentrated on it, fixed it securely in his mind, and then tore up the paper. In this way, he gained an eye impression of the name as well as an ear impression. All this takes time, but good manners, said Emerson, are made up of petty sacrifices. All this takes time. The importance of remembering and using names is not just the prerogative of kings and corporate executives. It works for all of us. Ken, an employee of General Motors in Indiana, usually had lunch with the company cafeteria. He noticed that the woman who worked behind the counter always had a scowl on her face. She had been making sandwiches for about 2 hours, and I was just another sandwich to her. I told her what I wanted, and she weighed out the ham on a little scale. Then she gave me one leaf of lettuce and a few potato chips and handed them to me. The next day I went through the same line, same woman, same scowl. The only difference was I noticed her name tag. I smiled and said, "Hello, Eunice," and then told her what I wanted. Well, she forgot the scale, piled on the ham, and gave me 3 leaves of lettuce and heaped the potato chips until they fell off the plate. We should be aware of the magic contained in the name and realize that this single item is wholly and completely owned by the person with whom we are dealing, and nobody else. The name sets the individual apart. It makes him or her unique among all others. The information we are imparting on the request we are making takes on the special importance when we approach the situation with the names of individual. From the waitress to the senior executives, the name will work magic as we deal with others. Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. Fourth principles, an easy way to become a conversationalist. Some time ago, I attended a bridge party. I don't play bridge, and there was a woman there who didn't play bridge either. She had discovered that I had once been Lowell Thomas' manager before we went onto the radio, and that I had traveled in Europe a great deal while helping him prepare the illustrated travel talks he was then delivering. So she said, "Oh, Mr. Carnegie, I do want you to tell me about all the wonderful places you have visited and the sights you have seen." As we sat down on the sofa, she remarked that she and her husband had recently returned from a trip to Africa. "Africa," I exclaimed. "How interesting. I have always wanted to see Africa, but I never got there except for a 24-hour stay once in Algiers." "Tell me, did you visit the big-name country?" "Yes." "How fortunate. I envy you. Do tell me about Africa." That kept her talking for 45 minutes. She never again asked me where I had been or what I had seen. She didn't want to hear me talking about my travels. All she wanted was an interested listener, so she could expand her ego and tell about where she had been. Was she unusual? No. Many people are like that. For example, I met a distinguished botanist at a dinner party given by a New York book publisher. I had never talked to a botanist before, and I found him fascinating. I literally sat on the edge of my chair and listened while he spoke of exotic plants and experiments in developing new forms of plant life and indoor gardens, and even told me astonishing facts about the humble potato. I had a small indoor garden of my own, and he was good enough to tell me how to solve some of my problems. As I said, we were at a dinner party. There must have been a dozen other guests, but I violated all the canons of courtesy, ignored everyone else, and talked for hours to the botanist. Midnight came. I said goodnight to everyone and departed. The botanist then turned in our host and paid me several flattering compliments. I was most stimulating. I was this and I was that, and he ended by saying I was the most interesting conversationalist. An interesting conversationalist? Why, I had said hardly anything at all. I couldn't have said anything if I had wanted to without changing the subject, for I didn't know any more about botany than I knew about the autonomy of penguin. But I had done this. I had listened intently. I had listened because I was genuinely interested, and he felt it. Naturally, that pleased him. That kind of listening is one of the highest compliments we can pay anyone. Few human beings, wrote Jack Woodford in Strangers in Love, few human beings are proof against the implied flattery of rapt attention. I went even further than giving him rapt attention. I was hearty in my approbation and lavish in my praise. I told him that I had been immensely entertained and instructed, and I told him I wished I had his knowledge, and I did. I told him that I should love to wander the fields with him, and I have. I told him I must see him again, and I did. And so I had him thinking of me as a good conversationalist, when in reality I had been merely a good listener and had encouraged him to talk. What is the secret, the mystery of a successful business interview? Well, according to former Harvard president, there is no mystery about successful business intercourse. Exclusive attention to the person who is speaking to you is very important. Nothing else is so flattering as that. Exclusive attention to the person who is speaking to you is very important. Nothing else is so flattering as that. Executive attention to the person who is speaking to you is very important. Nothing else is so flattering as that. Eliot himself was the past master of the art of listening. Henry James, one of the America's first great novelists, recalled, Dr. Eliot's listening was not mere silence, but a form of activity. Sitting very erect on the end of his spine, with hands joined in his lap, making no movement except that he revolved his thumbs around each other faster or slower. He faced his interlocutor and seemed to be hearing with his eyes as well as his ears. He listened with his mind and attentively considered what you have said while you said it. At the end of the interview, the person who had talked to him felt that he had had his way. Self-evident, isn't it? You don't have to study for 4 years in Harvard to discover that. Yet I know and you know department store owners who will rent expensive space, buy their goods economically, dress their windows appealingly, spend thousands of dollars in advertising, and then hire clerks who haven't the sense to be good listeners. Clerks who interrupt customers, contradict them, irritate them, and all the drive them from the store. A department store in Chicago almost lost a regular customer who spent several $1,000s each year in that store because a sales clerk wouldn't listen. Mrs. Henrietta Douglas, who took our course in Chicago, had purchased a coat at a special sale. After she had brought it home, she noticed that there was a tear in the lining. She came back to the next year and asked the sales clerk to exchange it. The clerk refused even to listen to her complaint. You bought this at a special sale, she said. She pointed to the sign on the wall. Read that. All sales are final. Once you bought it, you have to keep it. Sew up the lining yourself. But this was damaged merchandise. Mrs. Douglas complained. Makes no difference. The clerk interrupted. Final's final. Mrs. Douglas was about to walk out indignantly, swearing never to return to that store ever, when she was greeted by the department manager, who knew her from her many years of patronage. Mrs. Douglas told her what had happened. The manager listened attentively to the whole story, examined the coat, and then said, Special sales are final, so we can dispose the merchandise at the end of the season. But this no-return policy does not apply to damaged goods. We will certainly repair or replace the lining, or if you prefer, give you your money back. What a difference in treatment. If that manager had not come along and listened to the customer, a long-term patron of that store could have been lost forever. Listening is just as important as in one's home life as a world's business. Millie Esposito, New York, made it her business to listen carefully when one of the children wanted to speak with her. One evening she was sitting in the kitchen with her son, Robert, and after a brief discussion of something that was on his mind, Robert said, Mom, I know that you love me so much. You love me very much, was touched and said, Of course I love you very much. Did you doubt it? Robert responded, No, but I really know you love me because whenever I want to talk to you about something, you should stop whatever you are doing and listen to me. The Chronic Picker. The chronic kicker, even the most violent critic, will frequently soften and be subdued in the presence of the patient's sympathetic listener, a listener who will be silent while the irate fault finder dilates like a king cobra and spews the poison out of his system. To illustrate, the New York telephone company discovered a few years ago that it had to deal with one of the most vicious customers who ever cursed a customer service representative, and he did curse. He raved, he threatened to tear the phone out by his roots. He refused to pay certain charges that he declared were false. He wrote letters to the newspaper. He filled innumerable complaints with the Public Service Commission, and he started several suits against the telephone company. At last, one of the company's most skillful troubleshooters was sent to the interview with this stormy patrol. The troubleshooter listened and let the cantankerous customer enjoy himself pouring out his tirade. The telephone representative listened and said yes, and sympathized with his grievance. He raved on, and I listened for nearly 3 hours. The troubleshooter said as he related his experiences before one of the author's classes. Then I went back and listened some more. I interviewed him 4 times, and before the 4th visit was over, I had become a charter member of the organization he was starting. He called it the Telephone Subscribers Protective Association. I am still a member of this organization, and so far I know I'm the only member in the world today besides Mr. I listened and sympathized with him on every point that he made during these interviews. He had never had a telephone representative talk with him that way before, and he became almost friendly. The point on which I want to see him was not even mentioned on the first visit, nor was it mentioned on the second or third. But upon the 4th interview, I closed the case completely. He paid all his bills in full, and for the first time in the history of his difficulties with the telephone company, he withdrew his complaints from the Public Service Commission. Doubtless Mr. had considered himself a holy crusader, defending the public rights against callous exploitation. But in reality, what he had really wanted was a feeling of importance. He got this feeling of importance by kicking and complaining, but as soon as he got his feeling of importance from representative of the company, his imagined grievances vanished into the air. One morning, years ago, an angry customer stormed into the office founder of the Dapmer Woolen Company, which later became the world's largest country distributor of woolens in the tailoring trade. This man owed us a small sum of money, Mr. Detmer explained to me. The customer denied it, but we knew he was wrong, so our credit department had insisted that he pay. After getting a number of letters from our credit department, he packed his grip, made a trip to Chicago, and hurried into my office to inform me not only that he was not going to pay that bill, but that he was never going to buy another dollar's worth of goods from Detmer Woolen Company. I listened patiently to all that he had to say. I was tempted to interrupt, but I realized that would be bad policy, so I let him talk himself out. When he finally simmered down and got into receptive mood, I said quietly, "I want to thank you for coming to Chicago and tell me about this. You have done me a great favor, for if our credit department has annoyed you, it may annoy other good customers, and that would be just too bad. Believe me, I am far more eager to hear this than you are to tell it." That was the last thing in the world he expected me to say. I think he was a trifle disappointed, because he had come to Chicago and tell me a thing or two. But here I think I was thanking him instead of scrapping with him. I assured him we would wipe the charge out of the books and forget it, because he was a very careful man with only one account to look after, while our clerks had to look after thousands. Therefore, he was less likely to be wrong than we were. I told him that I understood exactly how he felt, that if I were in his shoes, I should undoubtedly fed precisely as he did, since he wasn't going to buy from us anymore. I recommended some other woolen houses. In the past, we had usually lunched together when he came to Chicago, so I invited him to have lunch with me this day. He accepted reluctantly, but when he came back to the office, he placed a larger order than even before. He returned home with a softened mood and wanting to be just as fair with us as we had been with him, looked over his bills, found out that had been mislaid, and sent us a check with his apologies. Later, his wife presented him with the baby boy. He gave his son a middle name of Detmer, and he remained a friend and customer of the house until his death 22 years afterwards. Years ago, a poor Dutch immigrant boy washed the windows of the bakery shop after school to help support his family. His people were too poor that in addition he used to go out in the street with a basket every day and collect stray bits of coal that had fallen in the gutter where the coal wagons had delivered fuel. That boy, Edward Bach, never got more than 6 years of schooling in his life, yet eventually he made himself one of the most successful magazine editors in the history of American journalism. How did he do that? That is a long story, but how he got his start can be told briefly. He got his start by using the principles advocated in this chapter. He left school when he was 13 and became office boy for Western Union, but he didn't for one moment give up the idea of an education. Instead, he started to educate himself. He saved his car fares and went without lunch until he had enough money to buy an encyclopedia of American biography, and then he did an unheard of thing. He read the lives of famous people and wrote them asking for additional information about their childhoods. He was a good listener. He asked famous people to tell him more about themselves. He wrote General James A. Garfield, who was then running for president, and asked if it was true that he was once a cowboy on a camel. And Garfield replied. He wrote General Grant asking about a certain battle, and Grant drew a map for him and invited this 14-year-old boy to dinner and spent the evening talking to him. Soon our Western Union messenger messenger boy was corresponding with many of the most famous people in this nation. Ralph Oliver, Louisa, General Sherman, and Jefferson Davis. Not only did the correspond with these distinguished people, but as soon as he got a vacation, he visited many of them as a welcome guest in their homes. Their experience imbued him with a confidence that was invaluable. These men and women fired him with a vision and ambition that shaped his life. All this, let me repeat, was made possibly solely by the application of the principles we are discussing here. Isaac, a journalist who interviewed hundreds of celebrities, declared that many people fail to make a favorable impression because they don't listen attentively. Many people fail to make a favorable impression because they don't listen attentively. They have been so much concerned with what they are doing to say next that they do not keep their ears up. Ears open. Very important people have told me that they prefer good listeners to good talkers, but the ability to listen seems rarer than almost any other good trait. And not only important personages crave a good listener, but ordinary folks do too. As the readers of Digest once said, many persons call a doctor when all they want is an audience. During the darkest hours of Civil War, Lincoln wrote to an old friend in Springfield asking him to come to Washington. Lincoln said he had some problems he wanted to discuss with him. The old neighbor called the White House, and the Lincoln talked to him for hours about the advisability of issuing a proclamation freeing the slaves. He went over all the arguments for and against such a move, and then read letters and newspaper articles, denouncing him for freeing the slaves and others denouncing him for fear he was going to free them. And after talking for hours, Lincoln shook hands with his old neighbor, said good night, and sent him back to Springfield without even asking for his opinion. Lincoln had done all the talking himself. That seemed to clarify his mind. He seemed to feel easier after the talk, the old friend said. He hadn't wanted advice. He had wanted merely a friendly, sympathetic listener to whom he had unburdened himself. That's what we all want when we are in trouble. That is frequently all the irritated customer wants, and the dissatisfied employee or the hurt friend. One of the greatest listeners of modern times was Sigmund Freud. Freud, a man who met Freud, described his manner of listening. It struck me so forcibly that I shall never forget it. I shall never forget him. He had qualities which I had never seen in any other man. Never had I seen such concentrated attention. There was none of that piercing, soul-penetrating gaze business. His eyes were mild and genial. His voice was low and kind. His gestures were few, but the attention he gave me, his appreciation of what I said, even when I said it badly, was extraordinary. You're no idea what it meant to be listened to like that. If you want to know how to make people shun you and laugh at you behind your back and even despise you, here is the recipe. Never listen to anyone for long. Talk incessantly about yourself, and if you have an idea while the other person is talking, don't wait for him or her to finish. Bust right in and interrupt in the middle of the sentence. Do you know people like that? I do, unfortunately, and the astonishing part of it is that some of them are prominent. Bores, that is all they are. Bores, intoxicated with their own egos, drunk with the sense of their own importance. People who talk only of themselves think only of themselves, and those people who think of themselves are hopelessly uneducated. They are not educated, no matter how instructed they may be. So if you aspire to be a good conversationalist, be an attentive listener. To be interesting, be interested. Ask questions that people will enjoy answering. Encourage them to talk about themselves and their accomplishments. Remember that the people you're talking to are 100 times more interested in themselves and their wants and problems than they are in you and your problems. A person's toothache means more to that person than a famine in China, which kills 1 million people. A boil on one snack interests one more than 40 earthquakes in Africa. Think of that the next time you start a conversation. Be a good listener. Encourage others to talk about themselves. How to interest people. The fifth principle. Everyone who has ever a guest of Theodore was astonished at the range of the diversity of his knowledge. Whether his visitor was a cowboy or a rough rider, a New York politician or a diplomat, he knew what to say. And how was it done? The answer was simple. Whenever he expected a visitor, he sat up late at night before reading up their subject in which he knew his guest was particularly interested. For he knew, as all leaders know, that the royal road to the person's heart is to talk about the things he or she treasures most. The genial William Phelps, essayist and professor of literature at Yale, learned this lesson early in life. When I was 8 years old and was spending a weekend visiting my Aunt Libby Lindsley at her home in Stratford on the Housatonic. He wrote in his essay on human nature, a middle-aged man who called one evening, and after a polite skirmish with my aunt, he devoted his attention to me. At that time, I happened to be excited about boats, and the visitor discussed the subject in a way that seemed to me particularly interesting. After he left, I spoke of him with enthusiasm. What a man! My aunt informed me he was a New York lawyer, that he cared nothing whatever about boats, that he took not the slightest interest in the subject. But why then did he talk all the time about boats? Because he is a gentleman. He saw you were interested in boats, and he talked about things he knew would interest and please you. He made himself agreeable, and William Lyon Phelps added, I never forgot my aunt's remark. As I write this chapter, I have before me a letter from him, who was actively a Boy Scout work. One day I found I needed a favor, wrote Mr. Chalif. A big Scout jamboree was coming off in Europe, and I wanted the president of one of the largest corporations in America to pay the expenses of one of my boys for the trip. But fortunately, just before I went to see this man, I heard that he had drawn a check for $1 million, and that after it was cancelled, he had it framed. So the first thing I did was, when I entered his office, was to ask to see the check. A check for $1 million. I told him I never knew that anybody had ever written such a check, and that I wanted to tell my boys that I had actually seen a check for $1 million. He gladly showed it to me. I admired it and asked him to tell me all about how it happened and to be drawn. You notice, don't you, that Mr. Chalif didn't begin by talking about the Boy Scouts or the Jamboree or Europe or what it was he wanted. He talked in terms of what he interested the other man. Here's the result. Presently, the man I was interviewing said, Oh, by the way, what was it you wanted to see me about? So I told him. To my vast surprise, he not only granted immediately what I asked for, but much more. I had asked him to send only one boy to Europe, but he sent 5 boys, and myself gave me a letter of credit for $1,000 and told us to stay in Europe for 7 weeks. He also gave me letters of introduction to his branch presidents, putting them at our service, and he himself met us in Paris, and showed us the town. Since then, he has given jobs to some of the boys whose parents were in want, and he is still active in our group. Yet I know if I hadn't found out what he was interested in and got him warmed at first, I wouldn't have found him 1/10 as easy to approach. Is this a valuable technique to be used in business? Is it? Let's see. Take Henry and Sons, a wholesale baking firm in New York. Mr. Duvernoy had been trying to sell bread to a certain New York hotel. He had called the manager every week for 4 years. He went to the same social affairs the manager attended. He even took rooms in the hotel and lived there in order to get the business, but he failed. Then said Mr. Duvernoy, after studying human relations, I resolved to change my tactics. I decided to find out what interested this man, what caught his enthusiasm. I discovered he belonged to a society of hotel executives called the Hotel Readers of America. He not only belonged, but his bubbling enthusiasm had made him president of the organization and president of the international greeters. No matter where his conventions were held, he would be there. So when I saw him the next day, I began talking about the greeters. What a response I got. What a response. He talked to me for half an hour about the greeters, his tones vibrant with enthusiasm. I could plainly see that this society was not only his hobby, it was the passion of his life. Before I left his office, he had sold me a membership in his organization. In the meantime, I had said nothing about bread, but a few days later, his steward of his hotel phoned me to come over with samples and prices. "I don't know what you did to the old boy," the steward greeted me, "but he sure is sold on you. Think of it. I had been drumming at that man for 4 years trying to get his business, and I'd still be drumming at him if I hadn't finally taken the trouble to find out what he was interested in and what he enjoyed talking about." Edward Maryland, those who chose to live in the beautiful Cumberland Valley of Maryland after he completed his military service. Unfortunately, at that time, there were few jobs available in the area, and little research uncovered the fact that a number of companies in the area were either owned or controlled by an unusual business maverick. However, he was known for being inaccessible to job seekers. Mr. Harriman wrote, "I interviewed a number of people and found that his major interest was anchored in his drive for power and money. Since he protected himself from people like me by using the dedicated and stern secretary, I studied his interests and goals, and only then I paid an unannounced visit at her office. She had been Mr. Funkhauser's orbiting satellite for about 15 years. When I told her I had a proposition for him which might translate itself into financial and political success for him, she became enthused. I also conversed for him. She became enthused, and I also conversed with her about her constructive participation in his success. After this conversation, she arranged me to meet Mr. Funkhauser. I entered his huge, impressive office determined not to ask directly for a job. He was agitated. He was seated behind a large carved desk and thundered at me. "How about it, young man? I believe I can make money for you." He immediately rose and invited me to sit in one of the large unholstered chairs. I enumerated my ideas and qualifications I had to realize these ideas, as well as how they would contribute to his personal success and that of his business. RJ, as he became known to me, hired me at once, and for over 20 years I have grown in the enterprises, and we both have prospered. Talking in terms of the other person's interest pay off their both parties. A leader in the field of employee communications has always followed this principle. When asked what reward we got from it, he responded that he not only received a different reward from each person, but that in general the reward had been an enlargement of his life each time he spoke to someone. How to make